It is Wednesday, it's the 16th of July. You're watching ARIRANG, Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gon-young. Let's begin with President Park's first major cabinet reshuffle since taking office early last year. Following a series of failed personnel nominations, President Park Geun-hye has announced the appointment of 6 new cabinet members. This, of course, with a long list of state affairs hanging in the balance. Our Choo-sun reports that the president is determined to move forward in running the nation and seeking greater cooperation with the National Assembly.
President Park Geun-hye has appointed 5 of her cabinet nominees who were confirmed by Parliament last week. Her spokesperson said the president appointed Choi Kyung-hwan as the new finance minister and deputy prime minister and Lee Byoungjoo as the head of the National Intelligence Service on Tuesday. She also appointed Choi Yang-hee, Lee Ki-kwon, and Kim Byoungjoo as the ministers of science, labor, and gender equality, respectively. And despite the parliament's disapproval, President Park went ahead and appointed Chung Jong-sub as the new security minister. The president, who retained the current prime minister after her 2 previous nominees stepped aside and who withdrew her nomination for education minister Tuesday, cannot afford further delays in handing over state affairs to a new cabinet. After dropping education minister designate Kim Byoungjoo, who was grilled by parliament over allegations of thesis plagiarism, President Park quickly nominated Hwang Woo-yeol, her political aide and a prominent figure within the ruling party. Hwang is close to the president, and if confirmed by the National Assembly, he would join new finance minister Choi Kyung-hwan as the president's 2 deputy prime ministers, a move likely intended to expand cooperation with the parliament. Meeting with the ruling and opposition parties' leadership in recent days, President Park sought the parliament's cooperation on a series of bills to revitalize the economy and others to reform the government and public sector in the aftermath of April's ferry tragedy. Meanwhile, Culture Minister nominee Chung Sung-keun, who was not confirmed by the National Assembly, dropped his bid Wednesday morning. Choi-sun, ARIRANG News.
Now, South Korea's chief nuclear envoy Hwang Jun-guk will meet with his Japanese counterpart Junichi Ihara for talks on this Wednesday in Tokyo. North Korea's recent military provocations will top the agenda, along with ways to restart the 6-party nuclear talks. The multilateral dialogue aimed at denuclearizing North Korea includes the 2 Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, but it has been at a standstill since 2008. And there has been rumors of a possible visit by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to North Korea, and the 2 nuclear envoys will also touch upon Tokyo's recent discussions with Pyongyang. Seoul and Washington have expressed concerns that Japan's talks with the North might affect their trilateral security alliance. And senior officials from South Korea and Japan will meet next week to resume talks on Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women. An official at Seoul's Foreign Ministry said Wednesday that the monthly meeting will take place in Seoul this time. Now, it will be their first such talk since Japan carried out a review of the Kono Statement, which is its landmark apology to the so-called comfort women issued in 1993. Now, also on the agenda is a possible meeting between the foreign ministers of the 2 countries on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum in Myanmar next month. And the UN Human Rights Committee has begun a regular 2-day examination of Japan's human rights record. This is according to Japan's Kyodo News Agency. 18 legal experts from the UN body are looking at a number of issues dating back to the Japanese military's forced sexual enslavement of women leading up to and during World War II. They'll also examine more current issues, including Japanese nationalist groups that hold regular demonstrations against ethnic Koreans and immigrants and the state's use of capital punishment. The committee requires states that have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to submit reports on their human rights record every 5 years. At the end of the month, the committee will advise Japan on areas where improvements are needed. Moving on, over in the Middle East, Israel has resumed airstrikes in the Gaza Strip and warned of an intensified offensive after Hamas rejected a ceasefire proposed by Egypt. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he had no choice but to widen and increase its aerial operation. This as Israel saw its first casualty in the 8-day-old conflict. Israel has held its fire for some 6 hours before resuming its aerial assault in the afternoon. Hamas said it could not accept a truce that offered no real gains for the faction, particularly as nearly 200 Palestinians have been killed in the conflict. Well, it's calling for more international mediation that could prevent future clashes. Now, on a different note, a growing number of college students are choosing to spend their summer breaks here in Korea. No, not on vacation, but to shore up their academic credentials. They're taking advantage of Korean universities that offer summer courses, and they're gaining a better understanding of Korea in that process. Our Shin Se-min went out to one of those universities and took a look.
Socializing with Korean students and immersing themselves in cultural activities. Students from over a dozen different countries gather at a Korean campus. They are taking part in an international summer course program for students and professors that a growing number of private universities in Korea provide. With nearly 100,000 international students currently residing in the nation, more colleges are designing programs and scholarship opportunities in hopes of bringing the world to Korea. To differentiate their experiences while spending the summer in Korea, universities have expanded the number of science and technology-related courses, which is something students expect due to Korea's tech-heavy reputation. Universities also send students outside the classroom and into internships at Korean-based companies, organizations, and even broadcasting stations. The opportunity to spend a summer overseas while adding college credits isn't reserved for those with money readily available.
As a non-profit organization, we, the university, have the obligation to foster young students regardless of their background. So we try to broaden our view by inviting students from developing countries and eventually letting globalization work on our campus.
Great benefit for us because we get to come here with the scholarship so that we can have a good opportunity to stay here, like learn about new things of Korea people.
Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
Now, the 5 new cabinet ministers who were nominated by President Park earlier today, they didn't waste a second. They went straight to work this morning. And Korea's new Deputy Prime Minister for Economy and Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan, for one, definitely has a lot on his shoulders. And in his first day on the job, he promised to aggressively pursue steps to stimulate the economy until it picks up momentum. Our economics correspondent Na Hyun-young has the details.
Low growth, a downsized economy in pursuit of better place, an absence of notable results. I think this is the reality we are faced with.
New Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan has made it clear that he will be proactive in his new role. In his inauguration speech Wednesday, Choi said passive macroeconomic policies have caused the Korean economy to slow down and have also resulted in less tax revenue. One of his plans to tackle those problems was to reform unnecessary restrictions that keep businesses from finding new investment opportunities.
When companies do well, they will, in return, create more jobs and up the earnings for households, which will spend more. We need to establish this virtuous cycle in order to strengthen domestic demand.
As he has long been hinting since being nominated, Choi reiterated plans to ease the debt-to-income and loan-to-value ratio regulations for mortgage loans to prop up the real estate market. Experts say the challenge will be doing so without drastically increasing already soaring household debt, on top of trying to boost consumer sentiment, which dipped after the April ferry disaster. Choi said the nation's growth outlook will have to be revised down and that an adjusted roadmap will have to be established, but added the ministry will not seek a supplementary budget this year. 나현경, ARIRANG News.
And the nation's central bank governor agrees that regaining consumer sentiment is essential to stoke economic growth. But he cautions against lowering interest rates, citing ballooning household debt as a major threat to this economy. Here's our Song Ji-sun.
Mounting household debt. That's what Korea's central bank chief thinks is the biggest threat to Korea's economic health. Bank of Korea Governor Lee Joo-yeol expressed concern on Wednesday that household debt is rising at a faster rate than income growth and that loan extensions are growing, particularly in non-banking institutions. Lee told an economic forum in Seoul that overall household debt is not expected to develop into a financial system failure, as high-income earners account for 70% of total household debt. But the low-income earners are having trouble paying off their bills, with those spending more than 40% of their income servicing their debts, which accounts for 11% of debt holders last year, up from 9% from a year earlier. Lee was on same page with the new finance minister Choi Kyung-hwan that spurring consumer spending and corporate investment are the keys to bolstering growth. But he said lowering key interest rate leads to a rise in household debts, eventually hurting purchasing power. As for the overall economic outlook, he added that growth would recover in the third quarter of the year, but there were risks of lower than expected growth in view of the volatility of the Korean won and the lack of confidence among businessmen and consumers. The central bank lowered its economic growth outlook last week by 0.2 percentage points to 3.8% for this year. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News.
Well, a new study suggests that government support designed to get companies to invest more in research and development is having the desired effect. The study was conducted by the Korea Institute of S&T Evaluation and Planning, and according to that, when the government increases its R&D budget by 1%, business enterprises increase their R&D investments by up to 0.2 percentage points within 2 years. Well, the institute says government R&D also induces an increase in labor productivity, particularly among SMEs. Korea has been pumping more and more money into R&D in recent years, and this year's budget dedicated to R&D is $17 billion, which is up more than 4% compared to last year. Well, the job figures for June are out, and the number of Koreans in work edged up from a year earlier, but job creation posted a smaller increase compared to recent months. Statistics Korea says that the number of employed people in the nation stood at a little less than 25.9 million. This is up almost 400,000 compared to the same month last year. The monthly increase has been on the decline since February, however, when it stood nearly 835,000. The jobless rate in June, meanwhile, was 3.5%, which is down 0.4 percentage points from a year earlier. Well, officials say labor market conditions have worsened due to sluggish domestic consumption in the wake of April's ferry disaster. Meanwhile, the leaders of the BRICS nations are forging a multi-billion-dollar financial alliance. The world's top 5 emerging economies agreed on Tuesday to establish a development bank to rival Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Our Connie Kim reports on the landmark agreement that could radically overhaul the existing global financial order.
The leaders of the 5 BRICS nations have signed a deal to launch a $100 billion development bank and a currency reserve pool with the aim of challenging Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
This will not only help increase the voice of BRICS nations in terms of international finance, but more importantly will bring benefits to all the people in the BRICS countries and for all people in developing countries.
The new development bank announced at the 6th BRICS Summit in Fortaleza, Brazil on Tuesday will fund infrastructure projects in the founding members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as other developing nations. With its headquarters in Shanghai and India as president the first year, the bank will start out with $50 billion in capital, with each BRICS country paying in an equal amount. Total capital is expected to eventually double to $100 billion. A so-called contingent reserve arrangement will also be created where each country will put in a designated amount in case of a currency crisis. The contingency fund will amount to $100 billion, with China contributing $41 billion, followed by Brazil, Russia, and India putting in $18 billion each, and South Africa chipping in $5 billion. BRICS represents about 42% of the world's population and accounts for roughly 1/5 of the world economy. The launch of the institution is being seen as a landmark achievement as the 5 countries started summit talks in 2009 to counter the influence of the West. If everything goes according to plan, the new development bank will start lending in 2016. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Well, China's economic growth picked up speed in the second quarter, indicating that the impact of stimulus measures may be kicking in there. Official data released Wednesday show that the nation's GDP grew 7.5% on year during the April to June period. That's slightly higher than market expectations and a rise of 2% from first quarter growth. Well, some analysts say that further stimulus measures will be required to meet the government's growth target of 7.5% for the year. Well, first there were paper monies and then credit cards, but will these so-called digital wallets replace credit cards in the near future? Well, local analysts believe that they will. That's according to a survey by a research fellow at KT's Economic Research Institute, and more than half of customers who use a mobile application called Smart Wallet to make payments have reduced their use of cash and credit cards. And the report estimates that the total sum of payments made through Smart Wallet services will reach $4 billion in Korea by the end of this year. The report attributes the shift to the spread of smartphone usage in the country and the convenience in making both online and offline transactions. Well, the Brazil World Cup came to a close earlier this week, with Germany, of course, taking home the coveted trophy. But Germans weren't the only ones happy with how the World Cup panned out. Korea's biggest tech firm saw their ultra-high-definition TV sales go through the roof as fans bought new TVs to watch the matches. Samsung Electronics says its UHD TV sales in Korea doubled in June compared to the previous month, and sales of curved UHD TVs grew at a similar rate. On the other hand, LG Electronics says its sales nearly tripled in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. A major electronics store chain says TVs were their biggest selling item this year as consumers decided to upgrade their sets to watch the World Cup in ultra-high quality. Well, 2,000 points, that's how we've known Korea's benchmark Kospi for the last 7 years. Analysts are saying that that is way too long for the main index to hover around. Let's take an in-depth look. Dr. Kim Byoungjoo joins me live in the studio. So, Dr. Kim, 2,000 point mark, it's what the main stock market index has been really flirting around for quite some time now.
Right.
And investors are complaining, in fact, some are enraged, right?
Right, exactly.
And saying that this is beyond disappointment. How bad is the situation?
Pretty bad. If you have your money invested in Korean stocks here, you mentioned 2,000 mark, sort of like we have been feeling actually you mentioned 7 years, but depending on how you see it, about 8 years, one can say, this kind of glass ceiling on top of our heads as the investor in Korean stock markets always there, keeping the movement of the stock market within these box ranges. These are the different boxes for each year here. As you can see, the red side, showing the annual peak, and then the blue bottom, annual bottom there. And just keep this in mind and compare that with what has been happening in the United States market, for instance, New York Stock Exchange. Their Dow Jones Industrial marking the highest ever recently, once again, continuously indeed. And the European market shooting up all the way. And even here in Asian market, Taiwanese main stock index actually marking 7th year highest these days. So many of these indices around the world, they're shooting through the roof, while Korean stock market, main index, as we can see on the screen right here, remains within this box range. So a lot of people are quite fed up with this and then complaining big time about what the future lies, actually, what lies in the future for Korea's equity market here.
Right. Some of us are too familiar with the 2,000-point mark. We never really thought about it being 2,000 or 2,500, 3,000 in fact. Obviously, domestic investors had disappointment results from the lukewarm market performance, but it works vice versa. I mean, it's really investors' disappointment acting that's slowing the trading market.
Actually, yes, it is a very important point. This is like a two-way street in a way in terms of interaction between investors on one hand and the market indices itself. Well, as you mentioned, investors are very much disappointed with the performance of the index itself, but we have to mention, let's bring up the illustration here. We have to mention that actually, the investors themselves are the ones that have been causing this phenomena, if you will, in big part. This here, we are comparing the index movement, the red lines on the left side, showing on one hand, and then inflows and outflows of the money into the mutual funds, stock market mutual funds here in Korea. And, quite high on the right-hand side, you see the zero side. So this is net flow in and out, and mostly we're showing net flow out here. Interesting thing is, every time the index, the red line rises, getting close to 2,000 mark, you will see the outflow out of the stock market here. And once the index drops low, there will be inflow big time. So Korean stock market investors, what they've been doing so far is kind of like pouring their money in once the index goes down, and then take their money out once the index gets close to 2,000. So it's like, both ways acting, one against one another.
So if that continues to be the case, this will become a cycle, a vicious cycle.
That's what we've been seeing for the last 7 and 8 years so far. Of course, in addition to that, there is a factor that is largely external. Korean stock market is very much dependent upon the foreign investors here, and their money flowing in and out matters a lot here. And a lot of people say the foreign investors' money pour into the market and then flows out, not necessarily having to do with the domestic economic factors, rather global economic factors. For instance, if New York market is hot, the money will flow out no matter what here. So in addition to this dilemma of interaction between domestic investor on one hand and the market itself, there is also a different factors such as foreign investors as well, all involved, making overall situation not exciting.
Right. Very dependent on external factors and that much more vulnerable to that as well.
Right.
Now, we know the concerns over this lukewarm stock market spans beyond individual level. In the longer term, it could very well become a national economic issue.
Very important point, because we have a very fast aging population here, and we need these people, we need a place for these people to invest their money, and we need a financial sector that's healthy and growing here. But increasing number of people who are getting older here in Korea are not at a loss looking for places to park their money, and they're finding the stock market is not the place to go. So indeed, the whole national economy faces a big challenge and trouble here.
So, the million-dollar question here, I always ask at the end of the segment, what needs to be done from here on?
The thing is, Korean stock market is a reflector of the collection of all the economic challenges, structural and the long-term challenges that Korean economy faces here. So all these things need to be worked out together. For instance, economic structure, where Samsung Electronics takes up such a big part of it, where it can drag up the index market and push up back and forth. No stability here, that needs to be addressed. And then overall governance structure of the corporations, corporate governance needs to be improved so that the corporations will become more generous in handing out their dividends. Not just to rely upon the price moves up and down, but if the investors can expect more of the dividends as a return, they will come back. So that needs to be worked out. And other things such as the overall structural change of Korean economy, moving on from IT and automobiles into new promising sectors, that could open up better future for the stocks. But once again, this is the table where all the variables are lying out there.
Right. So diversification and structural changes, what the market needs right now. All right, Dr. Kim Byoungjoo, thank you as always for today, and we'll speak to you tomorrow.
Okay.
And that is your business today on this Wednesday. Thank you for watching. Do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.